I never imagined that my life at 34 years old would take such a turn. For 3 years I worked quietly as a housekeeper in the mansion of Richard Blake, a man everyone in the city knew as a ruthless businessman, cold and untouchable. To him, I was invisible. I polished his silver, arranged his suits, served his dinners, and disappeared into the background. That was my life, unnoticed, necessary but never acknowledged. Then one evening, everything changed. Richard summoned me to his office, his tone clipped and impatient. He didn't even glance up as he spoke. "Evelyn, you'll accompany me to a dinner tonight. Don't ask questions. Just go behave and keep quiet." He didn't say please. He didn't ask if I wanted to. It was an order, as if I were an accessory he could pick up and put down at will. I should have said no. I should have reminded him that I was his housekeeper, not his companion. But something inside me whispered that this was a test, or maybe an opportunity. And so I nodded, though my hands trembled as I polished the last glass in his office. I didn't yet know that saying yes would change everything. That night, I put on the only elegant dress I owned. It wasn't designer, it wasn't new, but it was enough to make me look like I belonged, at least from a distance. When I arrived at the restaurant, Richard was waiting, immaculate in his suit, his impatience written in every line of his face. He barely looked at me, muttering, "Let's go," as if I were a burden. The moment we walked into that glittering dining hall, I felt the eyes on me. Wealthy investors in tailored suits, their wives in diamonds, all turning to see who Richard Blake had brought as his companion. I caught the flicker of surprise, the smirks, the whispered judgments. I wasn't one of them. I wasn't supposed to be there. But I kept my chin high, even as the weight of their stares threatened to crush me. Richard introduced me quickly without even my last name. "This is Evelyn. She's accompanying me tonight." That was all. To them I was no one, just a placeholder, a decorative piece. But when I sat at that table listening to the polished conversation about numbers and profits, something in me refused to stay silent. One of the investors, Mr. Lewis, turned to me with a smile that dripped condescension. "So, Evelyn, how do you feel about a dinner like this?" His tone suggested he expected me to blush, to mumble something insignificant, but I didn't. I met his gaze and said calmly, "It's fascinating to see how everything works up close. The numbers, the profits, the projections, they're important. But I think what matters just as much is the people behind them. Without people, the numbers mean nothing." The room went silent. Forks hovered mid-air. Even Richard froze, his eyes cutting toward me with a sharpness that could have sliced glass. I knew what he was thinking, that I had disobeyed his command to be invisible. But I also saw something else in the eyes around the table: surprise, interest, respect. Mr. Lewis chuckled, but it wasn't mocking. "An interesting perspective," he said. And the others slowly began to nod. I hadn't meant to challenge Richard, but I had spent years watching from the shadows, years observing his empire from the corners of his mansion, and I had learned something he had forgotten: people matter. And that night, for the first time, my voice was heard. Richard hated it. I could see it in the tightness of his jaw, the way he avoided looking at me as the dinner continued. Yet I didn't shrink back. When the talk turned to social responsibility, a subject Richard clearly wanted to avoid, I spoke again. I said that companies had a duty to give back, that profit without purpose was empty. My words were steady, my hands calm on the tablecloth, though inside my heart thundered. The investors listened, they admired. And Richard, he burned. He had brought me there to be silent, but I had stolen the spotlight. For him it was unforgivable. When the dinner ended, he stormed ahead, leaving me behind. And when we returned to the mansion, he didn't wait. He called me into his office, his voice sharp as a whip. "What were you thinking, Evelyn? I asked you to be discreet, not to become the center of attention." I stood there, still in my dress, still trembling from the power of my own words. But I refused to bow. I only answered when I was spoken to. "Mr. Blake," I said evenly. "I only shared my opinion." Opinion? His voice was dripping with disdain. "You're a housekeeper, Evelyn. You're not paid to have an opinion." Those words cut deeper than any blade. But instead of breaking me, they hardened me. I looked him in the eye, my voice low but unshaken. "Then why did you bring me at all?" His response was swift and merciless. Consider this your last day here, you're fired. I felt the blow, but I didn't flinch. I only nodded, my dignity intact, and walked out of his office for the last time. What I didn't know then was that losing my job would be the beginning of everything. Because the very man who had humiliated Richard that night, the investor who had watched me speak with conviction, would soon call me with an offer that would change my life forever. The next morning, I packed my few belongings, my hands moving mechanically, my mind still reeling from Richard's harsh words. I had expected anger, maybe tears, maybe a sense of loss, but instead, I felt clarity. That dinner had shown me something I hadn't realized. I had a voice. I had courage. And now, for the first time, I had the freedom to use both without being tethered to someone else's ego. As I zipped up my suitcase, the phone rang. I barely recognized the number, but when I answered, the voice on the other end made my heart skip. It was Mr. Lewis, the investor, who had observed the tension, the courage, and the conviction I had shown at the dinner. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "I want you on my team. I've never seen someone stand their ground like that. Are you willing to take a chance?" I blinked, overwhelmed. A chance. A real opportunity. My life had been filled with routines, tasks, invisible work. But this could be a turning point. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, my voice steady, though my pulse raced. "I'm ready." And just like that, the humiliation Richard had tried to impose on me became the doorway to my future. In the months that followed, I immersed myself in the new company. Under Mr. Lewis's guidance, I discovered skills and talents I had never been allowed to explore. I led meetings, strategized projects, and slowly confidence replaced the quiet doubt I had carried for so many years. Meanwhile, Richard's empire began to falter. His impulsive decisions, driven solely by immediate profit, had alienated valuable partners. The arrogance that had once seemed so untouchable began to erode everything he had built. And the irony wasn't lost on me. The very company I now worked for had acquired a significant portion of his shares, putting me in a position of influence that directly affected his business. The first time our paths crossed after that, it was at a major leaders' meeting. Richard entered stiff and tense, his gaze searching the room. And then he saw me sitting confidently at the conference table, papers in front of me, calm, poised, unshakable. His face pale, disbelief washing over him like a tidal wave. The man who had once dismissed me as invisible now had to contend with the woman who had become indispensable. Our eyes met, his expression, a mixture of shock, frustration, and if I dared to read it, regret. I did not flinch. I did not smile. I simply sat serene, fully aware of the power shift between us. What mattered wasn't proving anything to him. What mattered was proving it to myself. Later, as the board meeting progressed, Richard tried to assert his old authority, presenting his ideas for rapid growth. But the board's interest had shifted. They listened increasingly to my perspective, impressed by the clarity and foresight I brought to discussions of sustainability and social responsibility. Richard, for the first time, was not the one holding the room's attention. I was. When the meeting adjourned, he approached me in the hallway, his posture rigid, his voice tight. "Why are you doing this, Evelyn, helping to stabilize this company?" I took a deep breath. "Because unlike you, I believe in the value of people. And more than that, I believe in building something meaningful with or without your approval." He froze, the weight of my words pressing on him. For a long moment he said nothing, and I let the silence speak. That night, back at his office, I could sense his reflection, his acknowledgement of past mistakes, the realization that his own arrogance had brought him to the brink. But I did not gloat. I had no need. My satisfaction came from knowing I had risen, that I had proven my worth not through vengeance but through integrity and courage. Weeks passed. Richard's behavior began to change, subtly at first, then more genuinely. He attended social project meetings, engaged with the team, listened, truly, listened to people he had never before considered beyond spreadsheets. I guided him, yes, but I also watched him learn and adapt. And in that, I felt a curious mixture of triumph and hope. One afternoon, during a community project meeting, Richard and I observed women learning skills, preparing to enter the workforce, reclaiming dignity after hardship. I could see him taking it all in, the weight of past indifference pressing on him. And for the first time I realized the person who had once sought to control me, to diminish me, was now learning what leadership, compassion, and responsibility really meant. And yet our relationship remained complex. There were moments of tension, old power dynamics resurfacing, but also moments of genuine partnership and mutual respect. I found myself appreciating him, not as a boss, not as the man who had humiliated me, but as someone striving to grow, struggling with his own limitations, yet willing to listen. And in that there was something profoundly satisfying, knowing that transformation was possible, even for someone who had once seemed irredeemable. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of power and growth. Richard was no longer the untouchable figure I had known. He was human, vulnerable, and at times painfully aware of his own failings. Yet he remained fiercely determined to prove that he could lead even as the company's trajectory increasingly leaned on my guidance. For me, every interaction was a test not of him but of myself. Could I remain composed while holding the reins of influence over someone who had once dismissed me entirely? Could I assert my voice without succumbing to arrogance? One evening after a long day reviewing reports with the board, Richard lingered in the office. The quiet hum of the building, usually oppressive now, seemed to invite conversation. He turned toward me, his expression uncharacteristically tentative. "Evelyn, I've been thinking," he began, his voice lower than usual. "About the project, about the company, about myself." I didn't respond immediately, letting him feel the weight of the silence. He continued almost nervously. "I realize now that I treated leadership like control, like dominance. But it's more than that. It's about people. And He paused, searching for words I want to understand. Truly, his confession was unexpected and yet not entirely surprising. I had seen the subtle changes in him, the way he attended meetings differently, listened to staff, respected opinions he had previously ignored. But hearing him articulate it, seeing the raw honesty in his eyes, stirred something in me. I nodded slowly. "Understanding comes with time, Richard. It's not a moment, it's a practice. You can't control change, you can only learn it every day." Over the following days, our professional partnership deepened. Richard's involvement in the social projects became authentic. He no longer viewed them as mere PR exercises or leverage for his image. Instead, he engaged directly with participants, learning their stories, understanding their struggles, and slowly earning their trust. Each visit, each conversation revealed more of the man beneath the facade, a man capable of humility, empathy, and growth. I remember one particular afternoon when we visited a small community center. Women who had endured hardships, single mothers, survivors of abuse, all sat before us, sharing their lives. Richard listened, truly listened. His usual impatience replaced by quiet focus. One woman, Julia, spoke of how the project had given her a chance to support her daughter to regain independence and self-respect. I watched Richard's reaction, the subtle tightness in his throat, the way his hands clenched, the unspoken realization that his decisions could touch lives in ways he had never imagined. It was in these moments that I felt the balance of our relationship shift, not just professionally, but emotionally. I saw him not as a man who had once wielded authority to diminish me, but as someone striving to become better, inspired by the very people he had previously overlooked. And I began to see him differently too. The Richard Blake I had once feared and resented was transforming into a man I could respect and perhaps secretly admire. One late evening after a long community meeting, we walked back to the office through the quiet city streets. The air was crisp, carrying a stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy of the day. Richard glanced at me, hesitating before speaking. "Evelyn, I've been thinking about you. About how you've led, how you've guided, how you've held your ground when I couldn't." He stopped as though unsure how to continue. I looked at him, my arms crossed, though my expression softened slightly. "Go on," I prompted. He inhaled deeply. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding unprofessional. But I'm grateful. Grateful for your patience, for your courage, for the way you've challenged me and guided this company. You've made me realize what leadership really means." I felt a warmth I hadn't expected, a mixture of pride and empathy. "Richard," I said quietly, "you don't need to thank me. The change has to come from you. I just help you see what's possible." That night marked the first of many moments where professional boundaries blurred with personal respect. Over time, our interactions grew more natural, less formal, yet always grounded in mutual trust. I began to notice the subtleties, the way he listened to my suggestions, the way he paused to consider my perspective, the way his eyes softened when we discussed the people we were helping. And slowly, admiration began to edge into something more profound. Months passed, and the company thrived under our joint leadership. Projects expanded, communities flourished, and lives were transformed. Richard and I continued to work closely, sharing strategies, supporting one another, celebrating victories, and learning from setbacks. And with every success, the professional respect between us deepened quietly, giving rise to an unspoken bond, one that neither of us had anticipated, but both felt undeniable. It was during a particularly quiet evening in the office, reviewing reports, that he finally allowed himself a vulnerability he had long kept hidden. "Evelyn," he said, voice soft, almost reverent, "I don't just respect you, He faltered, searching for the courage to continue. "I admire you more than I thought possible. And I care for you, truly." I felt the words hang in the air, heavy yet sincere. I looked at him, my heart pounding yet steady in its judgment. For the first time, I realized that what had started as a test, a dinner, a challenge to my courage, had evolved into a journey not just of professional mastery, but of personal growth, trust, and unexpected connection. That night in the office, after Richard confessed his feelings, something shifted irrevocably between us. The air was no longer just professional. It was charged with trust, admiration, and a quiet intimacy that neither of us had anticipated. I looked at him, my heart steady, though tinged with caution. Years of observing him had taught me that true change is proven by actions, not words. Yet I also saw a sincerity in him I had never witnessed before, a willingness to learn, to grow, to become more than the man he had once been. In the weeks that followed, our partnership evolved naturally. We began collaborating closely on every project, our voices equal in decision-making, our perspectives complementary. Richard was no longer dictatorial. He listened, considered, and incorporated feedback from everyone, from board members to community participants. And as he adapted, I found myself respecting him not blindly but for the effort, humility, and courage he displayed. There were moments, small and fleeting, when our eyes would meet across a meeting table, or when he would pause mid-conversation just to acknowledge my perspective. Those moments carried a quiet weight, a recognition of shared purpose and growing connection. And slowly, admiration blossomed into something more profound. The man who had once treated me as invisible now sought to understand, to support, and quietly to love. One crisp morning after a community project review, we walked together through the streets lined with the people whose lives we had touched. Mothers, fathers, young adults, all who had benefited from the initiatives we had implemented, greeted us with smiles and gratitude. Richard and I moved through them side by side, silently acknowledging the transformation not only in the community, but also within ourselves. He finally understood what I had long known: leadership is measured not by profits alone, but by the lives uplifted, the trust earned, and the integrity maintained. It was during these visits that I realized our relationship had transcended professional boundaries. I saw his determination to be better, his attention to detail, his willingness to listen and learn. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel admiration for him as a person, not just as a former employer. He noticed my calm strength, the steadiness I brought to chaos, and I saw him start to value humility over dominance. Then came the day of our first joint presentation to the board as partners, not merely employee and employer. Richard stood beside me, his usual confident posture softened by reflection and preparation. When we spoke, our words were measured, informed, and aligned. The board observed our synergy, the clarity of our vision, and the authenticity of our approach. And for the first time, Richard experienced what it meant to lead not from ego, but with empathy and collaboration. After the presentation, Richard turned to me, a subtle smile breaking the tension of his usually stern expression. Evelyn, you've changed everything. Not just the company but me. He stopped, searching my eyes, and then continued with quiet resolve. I never imagined someone like you could teach me so much. About people, about leadership, about myself. I nodded, feeling a warmth that was both professional and deeply personal. We all learn, Richard. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from those we least expect. But change isn't a moment, it's a journey. You're taking the first steps, and that's what matters. The months that followed were transformative. Richard became fully engaged in every aspect of the projects, interacting directly with staff, participants, and the community. He listened more than he dictated, sought advice rather than issuing commands, and celebrated the successes of others without overshadowing them. The company, once on the brink, flourished under this new leadership. Investors took notice, communities thrived, and the impact of our collective efforts became tangible. Through it all, Richard and I grew closer. The boundaries between professional and personal life blurred naturally. Laughter returned to our interactions, and small gestures of appreciation and care became frequent. He began to express his gratitude not just for my guidance, but for the integrity and dedication I brought to every challenge. I in turn recognized the sincerity of his transformation, the humility he had embraced, and the deep respect he now held for me as a partner in every sense. Finally, after a period of reflection and mutual understanding, we acknowledged the bond that had been quietly growing between us. It was not impulsive passion, but a profound connection built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. One evening in the quiet of the office after a long day, he took my hand and said, "Evelyn, I don't just want to lead with you. I want to build a life with you." I felt the full weight of our journey. The humiliation, the trials, the growth, the triumphs, and I responded with honesty. "Richard, I've seen the man you are becoming. I'm ready to stand beside you both as a partner in work and in life, if we continue to act with integrity, humility, and care." And so together, we embarked on a new chapter. The company thrived, communities benefited, and we led with purpose and compassion. Our love, born from trials and tempered by experience, became a source of strength rather than distraction. Every project, every decision, every challenge was met as a united front. And in the quiet moments, I knew that my courage to speak up, to assert my worth, had transformed not only the company, but also the man who had once dismissed me. This journey taught me that true power lies not in domination, but in integrity, empathy, and the courage to stand up for what is right, even when no one expects it. And sometimes the most unexpected partnerships yield the most meaningful transformations, not just in work, but in hearts and lives. If you've been inspired by Evelyn's courage and her unwavering integrity, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on standing up for yourself, or moments when you transformed a challenge into opportunity. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else to take a stand.